Well, hello and welcome to the second in our series of Never Stop Learning with Epsom. This week, we're very privileged to be joined by an entrepreneur, a barrister, an investor, a speaker, Melvin Poh. Welcome to you, Melvin.
Thank you for having me, Matthew. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, you're welcome, very much welcome. It's actually, we're very grateful for you to giving up your time to be with us today. Now, Melvin has studied all over the world and worked all over the world too, but was born here in Malaysia. Whereabouts were you born then, Melvin?
So I was born in this town. It's called Ipoh, but I had a rather interesting childhood because almost immediately after when I was born, I was almost literally shipped off overseas abroad, and I've been living abroad for practically all my life. And then 4 years ago, I moved to Malaysia, really for the first time ever. And so it's been a journey of rediscovering my roots, and a very interesting journey so far.
Wow. Okay. So for the last 4 years, so and where are you based now? Are you up in KL or whereabouts are you?
So at the moment, yes, I'm based in KL and also Singapore, but I spend most of my time in KL, and I set up an office here, and so I've been pursuing my business here, and it's been a very interesting journey.
Fantastic. Obviously, in preparing for our conversation this afternoon, I've done a little bit of reading, and I was interesting that you were featured as in the Forbes 30 under 30, and then the Prestige 40 under 40. Is there? You look like you're a long way from being in a 50 under 50 list, but how did that come about?
It is quite interesting because practically, I think for almost the majority of my journey of actually pursuing entrepreneurship, the organization I've been building, it's been largely unrecognized until the recent years, really. And it was quite a surprise, especially, for example, the Forbes listing. One day I received an email that I'd been nominated, and at first I thought it was a scam. So I ignored it. And then eventually, after I believe 2 or 3 months, I was called for an interview. And then afterwards, I was listed, and it was just very sudden. And then all of a sudden, the others started coming as well. So then again, it is also because I think at this point, we have actually established quite a bit of traction, really, on the international level. So people have been noticing what we've been doing. So I'm quite grateful for it. Yeah.
Okay. Just again, what I was reading today was this that you founded the Asian Entrepreneur in 2013, and then you changed the name to Empirics Asia. And as I looked at that, and I'm a scientist myself, and I thought to myself, well, and as I've read more about you, would you describe yourself as an empiricist or an empiric?
Yes, most definitely. And I found my way towards empiricism by actually my own life experience. And I realized truly there is great value in and sort of empiricist approach to life. And personally, I'm very fascinated by philosophy and definitely epistemology. And so the great works of great empirics, they certainly inspire me deeply. And so it is very much also the ethos of our work today.
One of the reasons why I asked that is because when I looked at the definition of what is an empiricist, and it's a person who supports the theory that knowledge is based on experience derived from the senses. And later on, when we start talking about your work with AI, I'm thinking to myself, well, where did the senses fit in with AI? And maybe that's something we'll look at a little bit later. Let's see how an empiricist would balance the whole idea of actually something that's not using any senses at all. Or would you disagree?
I would agree. And actually, in terms of the AI that we've developed, it actually builds upon the very, you could say, the very essence of our work, which is largely based very much in experience and in the senses. So it isn't off on its own tangent, certainly. It's actually sort of a supplement to what we're doing. And so very much still in line with empiricism.
Okay, excellent. Well, we'll see how that, as we delve a little bit deeper into the work that you're doing with AI, we'll show, sort of examine that a bit further. Then, like I said, one of the things people might not be familiar with this idea of the Asian entrepreneur or Empirics Asia. It's been likened to Wikipedia, but I visited the site today and I thought it was very different. Do you want to just explain what you think the similarities and the differences are between Wikipedia and Empirics Asia?
Sure, and we get this comparison all the time, and oftentimes I see it as a compliment, really, if someone says, "Oh, this is like Wikipedia," or "Are you trying to be Jimmy Wales?" Because to me, Wikipedia is one of the greatest innovations, really, in recent history, in my opinion. Up there, along with the smartphone and everything else, it truly has contributed greatly, I think, to human development from the standpoint of knowledge. But we are very different. We're similar in the sense that we actually adopt a crowd publishing model, which is a sort of open journalism where people can contribute to the platform very openly. So Wikipedia does the same thing, this peer-to-peer model. But we are very different because Wikipedia at its scope and model is very much modeled after an encyclopedia. So it's supposed to be very neutral, at least theoretically speaking. Technically, they've got safeguards to make it so. But we are taking a very different approach. We're not trying to be an encyclopedia. Instead, we're trying to actually take this sort of experiential approach where we have people contribute their direct insights and experiences. And so the sort of way that they write is very different. Whereas Wikipedia, it's sort of, statement of facts, at least ideally. And then, of course, with us, you feel like you're talking to someone, you're listening to someone, sharing their experiences. So it's a totally different approach. And I would say both has their own values.
I think we might explore the idea of neutrality maybe a bit later, as well as I searched through your site and read a few things and listened to a few things.
Right.
I thought the website, obviously, when you visit Wikipedia, there's just facts and there's texts. Whereas I thought the Empirics Asia was a beautiful site. You're instantly drawn in to a number of different articles. And overall, I think I read that there was over a million articles. Are any of them commissioned, or are they all just voluntarily sent to you?
So in terms of our work, actually 96% of the articles are entirely produced on a voluntary basis, crowdsourced. And there's a small percentage that we used to have a team of authors that actually wrote for us because we started as a publication. Okay. But through it all, there is actually no commercial element to the content that you see. So we don't accept native advertising, nor do you see advertising in any form. It is truly open access and dedicated towards integrity of the content. So none of it is commissioned by any organization. It's entirely all sorts of submissions from people around the world, different backgrounds. Yeah.
Okay. But so then, out of these million articles, and obviously there are many coming in on a daily basis, how do you go about? For me, I was thinking with Wikipedia, it's no problem. I type something in, and the information about that, like maybe an encyclopedia appears. How are you choosing then what appears at the top of the screen? How are you choosing the featured articles, as it were? And is there not an element of non-neutrality once you start making those choices?
So how we try to do it is actually not so much based on subjectivity. I believe, of course, different people have different interests. Matthew, you might have certain interests as a scientist, and I might have certain interests too. However, how we approach it to sort of strike the middle ground is we make all the decisions based on data. So based on the traffic and also the interaction of the users, we identify the key trends in knowledge, and then those are the ones that you see get featured and really pushed up to top of our platform. And so it's not really a person deciding which one's the best in terms of what's actually featured. It's actually traffic. And nowadays, with our new artificial intelligence algorithm, we're also using AI to help us detect that trend.
Okay, so it's the readers are almost choosing the lead articles for themselves by being readers almost. Okay.
Yes, and it is difficult because, of course, again, it's sort of this arithmetic that's based on the majority interest. So certainly it won't reflect absolutely everyone, but so far it's been able to appeal to most of our readers, and so for us that's a good thing.
There's no doubt, as it was part of a busy day, and it was all I could do not to be drawn in to go and to follow different articles and the links to go with them. It's certainly something. Again, I'm a headmaster of the Epsom school, and I'll be recommending my students to go and visit and just take a read and follow their, like you say, their interests as they see the articles that they would like to read. So another thing that you have put together this year launched this year is this Empirics Podcast. Could you? Again, this was a fascinating setup that you've put together here. Can you just describe it, to anyone who's watching? Then, what is the Empirics Podcast?
So the Empirics Podcast is quite an ambitious project. I think it represents the first time, at least in human history, as far as we know, where an entire podcast show has actually been launched that is entirely managed, run, and produced by an artificial intelligence with no human involvement. So we've developed this AI that essentially will produce every episode and then narrate it, and then also study the feedback to all the episodes to sort of learn and then create better episodes in the future. All the objective of educating us humans. So a first instance of an AI that's been designed to teach humans about human knowledge.
Okay. So who writes the script? Who writes the podcast?
Yeah. So how it actually works is, again, we've looked at many instances of AI being used in this form of a medium. I'm not sure if, Matthew, you've heard of this very interesting case of, for example, a Twitter AI that just sort of went off tangent and became incredibly offensive. It is very much about the source material. And so for us, who writes the script is actually artificial intelligence entirely working with all the content that's actually found on our platform. So it's using the content to build the episodes that are narrated. And so there is a degree of control there, at least in terms of the information that we feed to it. And then, of course, we believe in the value of the information, of knowledge you find on the Empirics platform. So the AI is basically working with that in the way it's developing each episode.
So the sentences are written by AI, or are they taken from articles?
So how it works is our AI has an understanding of semantics and also grammar. It's part of the way it's developed. And so it's actually taking sentences and actually editing it to make it more concise in actually delivering it. And so far, the episodes we've had, there's not been too much of an issue. There's been some episodes where there were slight errors, but overall, it's been quite accurate in terms of being grammatically correct. And so it's working with the sentences that were written by the authors. Yeah.
So I'm going to come back to how I felt as I was listening a little while, and then the topics themselves. I mean, again, is it? I'm guessing it might be through data flow or requests. How are you choosing? I think the one I listened to today was the end of plastic, and I saw a list of others. How are the topics being chosen?
The topics are actually chosen based on the AI's understanding of the knowledge trends. So the whole thing really came about before the podcast, really with us trying to develop infrastructure to help us sort out all the information that we receive every day. It is very time consuming to actually sort out all of the content we get, and also to make assessments about what is actually relevant. So we developed this AI initially as an infrastructure to use machine learning to help us understand the traffic, identify knowledge trends. And so basically, this technology is very much at the heart of the Empirics podcast. The AI is actively studying the traffic on our site and the trends there. And then based on that, it comes to a decision on which episodes or which particular things to talk about. And so entirely done by the AI. Again, we have no involvement there.
If I'm going to be honest with you, Melvin, I found listening to the podcast, listening to the lady's voice. Does the lady have a name, by the way? Do you give a name to that voice, or is it no?
We haven't. Although she's modeled after an actress, but we haven't named it yet. No.
And do you share that? Do you openly share the name of that actress?
No problem. So the reason why, just to give you a bit of context, is I believe artificial intelligence generally presents two sort of responses in terms of us humans. We generally are fearful of it. Of course, it conjures up the image of Judgment Day, Terminator, Skynet, that sort of thing. Otherwise, we tend to look down upon it in the sense where we think it poses this existential question of which one's better. So overall, if it's not fear, then it's apprehension. So we thought the way to actually try and make it perhaps more accepted by people is to actually find a soothing voice that is human, so that at least when you're listening to it, you feel comfortable with it. It doesn't seem too strange. And so we studied around for the best voice, and we actually set on Gemma Chan, who's an actress, British actress. And it also presents a very interesting question of ethics, because we have the technology to actually model entirely like her voice, but then it raises a question of whether that's ethical. And certainly there's no law against that. But I think we're moving into a realm today where questions like this are posed, whether it's actually legal to do stuff like this. But for us, so we built something similar to a voice, inspired by a voice, but not exactly the same. But ideally, a soothing voice that you listen to, that presents a very comfortable experience, and hopefully one that people enjoy listening to.
Indeed.
So we haven't named her yet, but I suppose we could name her maybe Emma or something along the lines. Yeah.
Or perhaps, or even, take ownership of it with an Asian name, of course, isn't it? That might be.
We could. Yeah.
So
it seems strange to name her at this point, or even call her at this point, because again, we are making it so much more personal and humanizing it even more, and that is very interesting. One interesting thing we did was a part of our team worked on the AI project, and so not many people knew about the podcast element. So we actually played a few episodes for people to listen to in our company, and a lot of them didn't actually know, at least parts of it was actually an AI. So for us, that was a success. Yeah.
And I think, yes, absolutely, because and like you say, I've already assigned a gender to this voice, which is interesting, isn't it? That's indeed,
right.
Absolutely,
yes.
Yeah, great. Listening again, I found it because I knew I was listening to a computer-generated voice. I did find it a very unsettling experience. I did, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I mean, it was something I hadn't really experienced before, but it did remind me of something I'd heard before about how the more lifelike a robot is, the more human-like it is, the more unsettling it is to be with that robot. Is that, again, because I could feel to myself that it wasn't purely a human voice, but it was very close. And so, would you put it? Is that the move to make it even more human, or I don't know what? It's all those different feelings. I mean, how do you respond to that?
And I think that's a perfectly reasonable response, and certainly something that we anticipate. And I think, yes, you're indeed right. If you listen to the Empirics podcast at the moment, it sounds quite human, but it's not exactly that. And the reason why is because human speech, at least in our study of it as we're developing it, it is very complicated, especially human conversation, because besides just the voice, there's also a lot of things going on, tonality and many elements of it, and also how emotional you sound. For example, for our AI, it can't actually deliver jokes well. It isn't humorous.
There was no humor. Yes.
Yeah, and we've had one or two episodes where I think it tried to tell a joke, and it was just strange to actually listen to it. So it's all about time. It's a very complicated process, of course, as we know in human conversation. But what you said is totally valid. I can understand why, if something sounds more human, it's unsettling, because again, as I was talking about, it draws us back to this existential question. As these technology are becoming more human-like, and yet they are more capable than us, then what does that leave us? Where does that leave us? And what does it mean for our future? And certainly I can tell you this, the Empirics AI is incredibly capable. In my spare time, I have a hobby. I actually have a YouTube channel, so I share some personal thoughts. And I'm sure as well, Matthew, with you, with the Epsom initiative, there's a question of what episode should we do? What should we talk about? What could be relevant? And so we're taking time to think. But for us, it's a very sort of guesswork, really. Yet the AI is able to process thousands of data sets to get to the bottom of what's relevant and study data really well to potentially create better episodes. And again, it's a question whether any of us, as YouTubers or podcasters, are able to actually learn from every episode. But yet the AI is designed to do it in a very superhuman way. And so the more human it sounds, of course, it is very unsettling. It raises these questions. And one thing's for sure, it is going to sound even more human because the technology is expanding and developing exponentially. But to me, I think I can understand the fear, yet at the same time, I don't think we should be too fearful because, again, there are a lot of benefits of AI. I don't think they will entirely replace us humans, certainly. They'll be very good at certain things, but they will not be very good at other things. So, for example, as I was mentioning earlier about humor, I don't see, and I hope not, but I just don't see, at least in the foreseeable future, we will see a Netflix stand-up special coming from an AI anytime soon. It would be very, very difficult to do so, again, just based on what we understand of technology now. And also a question whether it will be the same thing. So I think certain things will still remain within the realms of human, if you will, and there's certain other things which are more suited for perhaps AI and automation. We will see more developments there. But even with automation, I think, in economy, in industries, I don't think it's a doomsday sort of scenario that jobs will be lost all of a sudden and we'll see widespread unemployment. I think what we'll see is actually certain roles will be made obsolete for sure. And the industrial landscape is going to change. But at the same time, that's going to create new opportunities and also bring about better innovations economy that will benefit us. So automation is not really this thing that's all of a sudden new. We've seen it time and time again throughout history, from early industrialization till now. And of course, people time and time again are afraid of what the ramifications of technologies are. But so far, what we've seen is more to do with obsolescence rather than just general unemployment. And so I think it's important for us to understand what's happening, understand these technologies, and also develop relevant skill sets that certainly will make us fit into this new industrial landscape of the future.
I mean, it's utterly fascinating. And as you're speaking, I'm wanting to go in all sorts of different directions with the thoughts and so on. But the thing that struck me and made me feel a little bit unsettled was the AI voice, Emma, if you like, whatever, was using words like we and us. And I was thinking, well, who is the we here? If this is a computer speaking, who is the we that she's talking about in that particular sense? So I think this was one of it was in the end of Plastic. It was talking about, it said, most importantly, we must let go of our way of thinking, and our dependency on those things that are hurting us most. So who was Emma talking about there? Was she talking about herself, the computer, or was she talking about us as humans? And on whose authority was she making those comments?
So in this instance, she's actually referring to us humans. It would be quite scary if all of a sudden she's talking on the behalf of all the computers out there and our devices. I think that's the start of it, some sort of a dystopian movie. But she's actually referring to us humans, but totally valid. And I entirely understand. It is a bit unsettling and strange because, of course, here all of a sudden we have this AI who's making this general statement on behalf of us humans. But again, to understand where it's coming from, the AI is actually making these deductions based on the content and the information that we have on our platform. So it's not making its own opinion in that sense, but it's actually aggregating a lot of data together to come to that conclusion. And so if you understand what you're listening to is essentially an AI that's working with a platform that is very much by humans for humans, but augmented by an AI that's delivering information concisely and making deductions based on that information, then it's a bit more understandable. But certainly, yes, I understand when you hear something like that, it seems it's a start of an uprising, but I can assure you, no, far from it. Yeah.
I didn't mean it in that way at all. And I kind of worked out for myself that it was drawing from articles and
Yes,
putting
yes.
those articles out, but it didn't help, you know. And if I'd been told beforehand that these were human words and it was a computer voice, but it was human words, it would have been less unsettling. And then you're left thinking, well, actually, then we're only that little step away from actually not knowing whether or not something we're being told has been generated by humans or has been generated by AI. And again, and that led me to sort of other thoughts there as well. The other thing I'm just thinking is, I'm guessing then that she says that we need to reduce our. We're both using she now, and I think there's that.
I think that's fine. I think that's fine. And perhaps potentially one day in the future, we might give rights to these AI. Again, it goes into this existential philosophical debate about what is actually consciousness and what constitutes an entity. And I think it's a fascinating area. And of course, there will be a lot of confusion in the future. You know, I've heard people refer to Siri as a she, and so I totally understand. Again, it isn't that strange anymore, isn't it, Matthew? Because again, the times we live in today, AI is just becoming incredibly more present, almost in every aspect of our life.
Another thought then that comes to my mind is that she's using these statements because they are the views of the majority of the articles that is being fed in. Where does the voice of the minority come in then, if this kind of way of presenting data becomes the predominant way of presenting data? Who represents the minority voice?
And I think this is a very good question, which unfortunately at the moment we don't really have a very good answer for, because again, you know, especially when you're sorting out with so much data, again, there are so many different views, especially the data we're talking about is actually content that we are trying to classify as knowledge, and everyone has different personal knowledge, personal opinions. But again, I think at the moment we live in a time where information is just becoming overly abundant. And in my personal opinion, I don't think all information carries the same weight. And that's the unfortunate thing, I think, of the time that we live in, is that information is so abundant and so easily accessible that we're not really so Google has created this great algorithm of personalizing things and giving us information, but it hasn't so much taught us how to actually weigh the sort of information we're given. And I believe the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard talked about it with mass media, but the idea is that there's a sort of leveling going on, especially on Google. You could all of a sudden see, for example, if you're searching about human anatomy, you could see all of a sudden an article on the first page, maybe the first entry, written by a Harvard researcher in biology about the human anatomy. And then maybe 2 or 3 entries down, a blog by a person who could be, you know, not to offend anyone in this situation, living in a basement, who has absolute no qualifications, not a scientist, writing about biology, and yet both information is found in the first page. And so there's this question, of course, you know, what is actually acceptable and what is accepted by the majority and by the minority. But the question is this: information, which one's actually, you know, worthy of being disseminated? So for us, what we tend to do, and also what we're doing now, is that we believe that, you know, bad information, at least on our platform, it won't be perpetuated, because firstly, besides the fact that we only work with information that most people find valuable, we also still have the human component. We haven't entirely eradicated the human component. And the human component is very important because, again, algorithms can do great things in efficiently processing data. But again, there is still assessment that needs to be done with information, whether it's actually credible. And I think, at least at the moment, with where technology is, especially artificial intelligence, it is still very difficult for an AI to entirely make the assessment. And so to answer your question, yes, you're absolutely right. Our AI, at least with the podcast, is currently building episodes based on traffic data, based on what the majority finds valuable. But at the same time, before it actually gets the information that's actually being presented has already been vetted by our editors and our editorial team. So to make sure that the information that we have is actually good information. Certainly, it won't be able to produce every single topic area, because again, there will be a lot of episodes otherwise, but at least in presenting what is relevant to the majority and what is generally acceptable, I think it should be able to do a good job so far. Yeah.
Again, just hearing you talk, and it's fascinating. And I'm just thinking, is the age of rhetoric, is that past? The idea of giving a very powerful speech or using words in a way that we as humans are able to use and having influence that way, that is only like a very small line of data that can be very, very influential. Are those things going to be missed by AI?
I think at least at where the technology is at the moment, it certainly doesn't understand rhetoric the same sense that us humans do. So, for example, in terms of at least me anticipating our AI or a future AI being rhetorical and delivering a moving speech about what needs to be done,
similar to jokes.
I think we're still quite yes. And you've heard the episode on the end of plastic, which is actually one that is supposedly quite rhetorical, at least in some sense. But again, it is very different in the way that a human's delivering it. And at least in the AI understanding the data, I don't think it will be able to understand rhetoric in the same sense as us humans would. But again, I won't say it is entirely impossible in the future. I mean, because again, the pace of how the technology is actually improving and developing is exponential, and it's incredible what it can do even within the end of the year. I think we'll see a lot of developments overall. So yeah, interesting area to really
You'll be learning all of those rhetorical tools and alliteration and all and emphasis and so on. Gosh, See, I'm still feeling a bit apprehensive, Melvin. You haven't. I'm feeling more apprehensive, if anything, but that's fine. I was just thinking then as well, this idea about neutrality, and again, how you choosing your articles. And again, I think I read in your title of Malaysia that you were trying to keep things to be neutral, although perhaps maybe not as neutral as something like Wikipedia. I wonder what you mean by neutrality, because when I listened to, again, this age of the removal of plastic, there's something there about that we have to find. It said finding an alternative to plastics is not a choice. That didn't sound like a very neutral statement. So where do you think neutrality sits for Empirics Podcast?
So there is one thing that we have to clarify very clearly, is that we're not going for absolute neutrality, because again, the nature of the content that we are publishing isn't the same as an encyclopedia. We're not trying to present the idea that our platform is an encyclopedia and you'll find facts in there. It is actually very much a hub for people to contribute their personal insights, their personal experiences, their personal knowledge, and of course, much of that could also be their personal opinion. And so for us, neutrality really is striking a fine line and allowing democratic access towards contribution of one's own insights, but at the same time also not devolving too much to only one area, but allowing everyone to really contribute their views. I think the way to look at it, at least what we're trying to build, is sort of this Hegelian idea of dialectics, the idea that if you have a mixture of all sorts of different opinions, we will arrive closer to the truth than, let's say, just one side. Again, but my point being that based on what we're doing now, we're not trying to be an encyclopedia. So the articles that you will find there, and also ultimately the episodes that might be produced by the AI, it will not sound like an encyclopedia in the sense that we're trying to present facts, but really the overall opinions and conclusions of people based on their works. So for us, how we strike that democratic access to contribution is really, we generally the only thing that we don't really allow is just a few things. Firstly, is that the content itself isn't offensive and frivolous, and at the same time isn't commercially driven, and then of course not being entirely nonsensical, then generally we allow it. But of course, the challenge for us is some of the areas might be a bit more technical. So for example, let's say a person writing in the area of, let's say, physics, quantum physics or something like that. Of course, there might be this requirement of us to understand what's being presented is actually valid. But how we go about it is really sort of this reactive process. We do have volunteer people who actually help us in filtering out information that isn't good. But overall, that's really it. We have a democratic system. We're not trying to only present it as facts, but really the opinions and experiences of people all around the world.
I think I can imagine that the collecting of articles is utterly democratic and it's just whatever people send in. And again, like sort of I said at the beginning, though, how do you go about choosing the articles that will appear prominently on the front page? And do you worry that you might be accused of some bias or a lack of neutrality in those choices that are made?
I think in terms of the article themselves, at least, let's say the weight of the article, so far we haven't really had much issues or really any issues about neutrality, because again, the articles we're not presenting it as, let's say, this is a statement of facts, but really this is the summation of a person's work or their opinions or their knowledge. And so, so far, readers, they've understood that at least. We're not presenting it as this is how the world works, but really a person's idea of how it works or whatever they're talking about. But in terms of the actual process of choosing what goes on or what's featured and promoted, again, that's very much based on traffic and relevance.
Okay.
It is very difficult, I think, for us, even if we were to act as some sort of a gatekeeper and choose which one's there, because again, there's a question of whether our editorial team, our editors, are neutral. So we leave all that up to data. But what I've found so far is that, generally speaking, this system has actually worked quite well, because again, most people, in terms of what they find valuable, if a certain content has great value, it tends to, or great relevance, it tends to actually get, read by more and more people than articles that are very, very low quality. So far, what we've had, at least in featured prominently on the front page, has been quite relevant, at least based on the feedback we've received. But not so much an issue on neutrality, at least from our readers at the moment. Yeah,
I'm probably getting.
I can imagine if we were presenting it like Wikipedia, then there's a question of neutrality, because a question of who's actually reading it. But of course, Wikipedia is based on a sort of peer review process, but totally expanded using the peer-to-peer model.
Yeah, and from my personal experience today, when I went there, I was instantly caught, and I wanted to follow things along in different directions. And we've spent quite a long time talking about this particular area and the way that AI is developing. And it makes me think about my students and about their planning for the future. I speak with them daily, and they talk about the kind of careers they'd like to go into the future. You've got a number of careers yourself, by the looks of things, in your different areas and so on. Are there areas that you would not recommend to young people, because actually that is somewhere that AI might take over? I'm thinking of things like a journalist, a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, maybe.
I think, again, a lot of the concerns at the moment with AI is this idea that it will lead to job loss and these areas being totally made obsolete. I think at least the areas you've mentioned, I don't think there's a great fear there yet. For example, I don't think AI, at least in the next 10 years, will replace, let's say, a doctor or a person in the medical profession or a journalist entirely. What I think will happen is that much of these industries that you've mentioned, we will see more involvement from AI as a technology, as a tool. So I think overall, my advice for students really at Epsom is that, again, try and understand the technological developments that are happening right now and actually build skills, not only to understand them, but potentially to know how to actually utilize these technologies in any fields of work you're going into, and be totally open to new models of actually working. And that's the thing that we'll see, I think. We won't see entirely an AI replacing the jobs that you've mentioned, but I think we'll definitely see more AI involvement. So for example, even in the legal profession, there's been a lot of fear of this idea of AI replacing lawyers. But of course, you can imagine AI could replace elements in terms of responsibilities. For example, sorting through hefty amounts of documents and files. But again, many aspects still requires a human involvement. And I don't think we'll see obsolescence there yet. But again, inevitably, we will see AI as a technology, as a tool being integrated into many of the jobs. So even in the area of journalism, what we're seeing now, even with our work, is you'll see AI actually being involved in sorting out data, but actually covering the story. It might still be very human still. But again, learning to be able to work with AI might be a requirement, especially if more companies take on AI. Even in our own company at the moment, we largely hire people in the editorial area because most of our work is actually editorial. So now that we actually have an AI infrastructure, all of our, at least our current existing editors, but also future editors, they will need to know how to actually work alongside with this technology in terms of their editorial work. But I don't think we'll see a time where it would just be me alone in the office and just all computers and servers running. That's still quite far off. But the necessity to understand the developing landscape technology, I think, is paramount. No matter what field you're in, whether it is medicines or sciences, or even the arts, learning to understand, ultimately utilize AI to your advantage is very important.
Okay. Fantastic. Our students, maybe watching this, or a wider audience will be watching this, and to launch something like Empirics Asia obviously takes a fair amount of, it doesn't happen by magic. It takes a certain amount of investment. Did you require investment to get this thing up and running and develop?
Yes, to date, we've actually raised initially $4 million US, I believe in 2015 or 16, and then in 2021, earlier this year, we raised another 8 million. So yes, investments is definitely a big part of what allows us to run, and not just us, but really entrepreneurs in general. And so being able to find suitable investors that believe in your vision, I think is very important, especially ones that you can work well with. Yeah.
How do you convince somebody to say, give me your 8 million and I'll use it well? How do you win that argument?
If only it was that easy, then that would be great. But it took a bit of time, actually. So what happened is in January, we rebranded from the Asian Entrepreneur to Empirics. And the reason the rebrand is actually, for the most part of our existence, we've actually only been focused on business knowledge. We've been collecting other knowledge content, but the majority was really in business and business in Asia. But through our experience of actually operating the Asian Entrepreneur since 2013, we've had opportunities to work with a lot of companies, some really prominent ones, especially in the area of publishing. So two of our key investors are actually in the area. But my point being that actually working with them, establishing a relationship with them, and also, again, demonstrating and proving your competence certainly helps. And I think, at least for the students at Epsom and anyone else listening, again, to actually secure investments, especially good investments, it's good to secure it from someone who knows you. It certainly helps. And at the same time, it also allows you to build an expectation from one another of how it would be like going forward, especially working together. Because again, raising investments isn't so much as just about getting a check and then, okay, goodbye. It's also a working relationship of how that fund's going to be used, and of course the different milestones that have to be met. So I've been told it's very much, and I believe it's so as well, it's very much like a marriage. It's good to find a good partner. Otherwise it could be a very different sort of experience, let's just say that. But the point being, the investors that we've actually known for quite a while. Okay. So yeah.
Okay. And then you get your £8 million. They give you the check. I think my students will be interested. How do you spend your £8 million or your $8 million? What would you, what's the money being used for?
So the way it actually works for us is that although we've had the money actually going, it's actually went into this other account that we have access to, but yet again in certain milestones. So it's not entirely we have access to 8 million upfront. There are certain milestones we have to meet, but again, it is a very sort of delicate and also a very careful process of actually setting out what you plan to do with the amount. What we've done so far with our fundraising was we've actually purchased a publishing company based in Taiwan, and the reason why is we're actually going into book publishing, which is also an area of interest for many people, because
paper books.
Question of whether paper books, yes, being one of them. And so another portion of it has actually gone into upgrading our infrastructure, which is where most of the AI development happened. a lot of people are focusing on the podcast, which is, of course, the cherry on top of the cake. But again, that's a tip of the iceberg, because what we've really done is created an overall infrastructure in editorial where AI is actually improving our platform and the experience of it by understanding how data works. So it is actually helping us with editorial process. So overall, the platform and the content that you will see being published will be more and more relevant. The podcast being, again, the tip of the entire thing. But again, to actually use the 8 million, as you mentioned, you have to have a very detailed plan that you have to submit, of course, to the investors to let them know it isn't just like going to ATM and withdrawing money. It has to be carefully submitted, approved.
Yes.
And yeah.
And you've got to stick closely to your plan. And as you were, if you can take yourself back to, in your school days, as it were, and I know you've been to school in a few different places, did you have your own personal ideas of what success would look like when you get to the age that you are now? And have things gone that way that you thought they would when you were having those sort of ambitions as a youngster?
Yeah, when I was very young, when I was in school, and of course, Epsom is a great school. I went to also boarding school, and I absolutely see the value of boarding schools. It's really shaped my life in many ways. But when I was young and when I was a boarding student, I used to think, success means, being financially successful and the image of having a nice things and a nice life. I can certainly say now that is no longer my definition of success. And the reason for the change is really what led me to my current journey. What happened was really failure. I experienced a failure that fundamentally transformed my worldview and also my personal view of life. Originally, what happened was I got involved in a business in Hong Kong, and I was, totally inexperienced, but ultimately it failed very badly. And I actually invested my savings into that business. And so it was really tragic, not only to be proven wrong, but to be wrong to such an extent. And that really shattered me. And the reason why I failed was I went into a business in Hong Kong, a place I've never lived at the time, with no understanding of the Hong Kong market. But what I did was I did a lot of research from as many sources as I could find. I bought the Asia Review, The Economist, as much research as I could do into the business I went into. But ultimately, I failed because I didn't have the experience of the actual market. I'd never lived there. And so for the longest time, I was very, beaten in a sense, especially affected my self-esteem. But I knew that there had to be, if only I could talk to people in Hong Kong and gain their personal experiences, the outcome might have been very different. And ultimately, this led to, the launch of the Asian Entrepreneur, really an idea of capturing the collective knowledge of doing business in Asia at the grassroots level, talking to people there and gaining their personal experiences and putting it all in one central place. And now that I've actually done that, and now it's way beyond business, I feel great, especially when I realize that it is solving, I think, one of the great issues at the moment in the world, which is the idea of being able to access the personal knowledge of people. And the highlight for me was really this moment when one day I received an email from a person who was living in this place in Mongolia, which I've never ever been to or heard of. It's called Ulangom. I believe I might be butchering the name of the place, but he wrote an email. This was 2 years ago. He wrote an email to me, and he said he'd like to thank me because he's been living in Ulangom and he's interested in entrepreneurship, but apparently there in Ulangom, it wasn't very established, the ecosystem. So he wanted to start a business somewhere in Asia, but he had no idea how, and he wasn't going to business school. So he found our platform, which is, of course, open access. And he found that he had an interest in fintech from one of our fintech writers. And he connected with this person who's based in Singapore. And eventually now they're both in Singapore and they've launched this fintech startup. And he's just glad that he found our platform. That led him to this. And, to actually see that I've been able to impact this person, I'm sure other people too, there's something truly, truly satisfying there compared to my initial idea of what success is, which is just having more things in life. It certainly is more meaningful in that way. And for me, especially when I know how painful it was to actually fail because of a lack of a resource like this, and being able to solve that is truly satisfying. Yeah.
Again, very interesting, and some interesting parallels with our guest last week, who talked about the idea that to be a successful business person wasn't just about making money. In fact, that shouldn't be the first thought. It should be about what is it that you really want to do? What is it that makes you tick? What is it that's your ambition or your desire? And that's what you should follow, rather than just thinking of an investment and making money.
Yes, and if I may also impart a personal view to the students at Epsom, and those anyone else watching, is that even if you were really to study it, especially from, and for me, my favorite area, but a philosophical angle, the common ideas of what success is, the ideals of success in our life, this idea of having more things, the ideals of consumerism, narcissism, materialism, these things don't actually make you happy. And especially if you look throughout the history of philosophy, most philosophers, they come to the same conclusion. It is generally an endless chase that you never sort of fulfill. You have a thing, but it's never enough, and then you want the next thing and next thing. So it is about much more than that, rather than these endless desires, but really deeper things. And one of the, I think, is definitely actualizing your own potential, doing work that's actually meaningful to you, and actually improving yourself and being a better person that you are today than you were yesterday. These are the things, the aspect of growth, the aspect of realization, actualization. These are things that are more meaningful and truly bring happiness to you than anything else. And again, I might sound very abstract here, but I have a simple proposition for the students listening. Consider the idea of actually, for example, buying an iPhone. You're very excited to get it, and you've seen the ads. It's coming out, and you get it finally. It's in your hands. You open it. It's amazing Indiana Jones moment. It's shining, whatever. But then usually after 3 or 4 weeks, it's just another phone, and you're thinking about the next thing. So I think generally in life, chasing many of these, what I would say, endless and also baseless desires will lead to dissatisfaction, never a really sustainable sense of fulfillment, I think. I think doing things that are more meaningful to you, and especially what I mentioned, those are things that really bring you a greater sense of fulfillment in life.
Speaking as a career-long teacher and head teacher, I can only agree with you 100%, isn't it? It's about finding that thing that you enjoy doing. I said last week, if you get bored of emails, I'll go and find some students to talk to, because that's the best part of any day. And I'm sure you've got your own things that you go to. Very interesting as well to hear you talk about failure, and I feel I could talk for a long time, but we're running out of time here to take those ideas forward. Last week they were talking about the idea that some people just cannot cope with the failure, and it would break them. But you have come back. So if I get the chance to speak to you again, we might talk a bit about resilience. Where do you find the resilience to keep going? Maybe just a couple of seconds. What was it that got you back up and got going again?
I think one thing that certainly that we should all think about is a person's character isn't really defined, in my opinion, by their moments of victory or the moments of comfort. I think a person's character is really tested and defined at the moments of their defeat. Yes. And the idea is that you want to go through life smoothly, but in life we will constantly face setbacks after setbacks. But what they really are is opportunities to learn and to improve. And that, if you think about it, success isn't really so much this straightforward process. It's a formative process that's formed through all the experiences that you've gained from all the things that you tried. And if you realize that it isn't really failure. Failure to me, I think, is when you face something that isn't so much in your desire, undesired outcome, and you just give up, and you make some sort of a conclusion, deduction about yourself based on that. And I think that's what failure is. And I think if you're able to see life as what it is, and really an adventure, all sorts of different outcomes and different things that you experience, and you take it on fully and with no judgments. And I think if you were to pursue it like that, then you would be closer to success and at least to your own fulfillment than anything else.
I think that is a great way to end our conversation this afternoon, Melvin, that we treat life as an adventure and that we try and get the most out of it, find out what it is we really love doing and pursue it with everything that we have. Melvin, can I just say you've been really generous with your answers this afternoon. I know I've taken you in all sorts of different directions, and you've been very generous with just telling me all the things that, you know, related to your company, your beliefs, and so on. And I hope that our students listening or others will really appreciate and learn from the things that you've been saying this afternoon. So thank you very much.
And thanks so much, Matthew, for the honor and the privilege to be part of this initiative. And it's great work that you guys are doing. And yes, I hope the students are able to take some things away and truly to be able to learn and really to be able to learn at such a great institution presents great value.
That's very kind of you, Melvin. And I hope that this is just our first meeting, and maybe we'll get to meet face to face one day. Maybe we can introduce you to our students too. But in the meantime, thank you so much, and very best wishes with Empirics Asia and your Empirics podcast. Yeah, they are fascinating, and I'm sure it's going to be very, very successful. So thank you.
Thank you.